is Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition and has also been Chief Steward on the many, there's some argument whether it's 21, 22, whatever, 20 plus national demonstrations over the past year in solidarity with Palestine, calling for a ceasefire and the end of arms sales, leading stewards teams of many hundreds of volunteers who actually ensure people have the right to protest and continue to, even despite when the police try to criminalise us. So please give a warm welcome to Chris Nineham.
Thanks to everyone for coming this morning, and to Michael Mansfield for a fantastic introduction to today. And I want to continue in a way in the same vein, in the sense that I want to talk both about the level of repression and the level of the kind of challenges that we face as a movement, but also to make sure that we don't forget the progress we've made, particularly in undermining the credibility of not just the Israeli state, but all of those around the world that support what Israel is doing. Because the police and the establishment in this country have been and are conducting a campaign of vilification and repression against the movement, the like of which I think we haven't seen since the miners' strike, is the truth. And we've seen, it's not just, in a way, it's not just a campaign against the movement, although it's focused on the movement. It's really a campaign against freedom of speech in general in this country, and certainly on this issue of Palestine. We've seen unprecedented use of control orders against the demonstrations, early morning house raids on journalists, suspension of student activists, arrest of people for wearing what the police regard, and the police judge, for God's sake, as being a placard or a t-shirt that is hateful or dangerous. A whole host of attacks, and in general a climate of fear, a kind of chill factor that has pervaded, I think, institutions right across society. And I just want to say at the beginning that I think it's important that we all take the attitude that we should take no lectures from the Metropolitan Police or any other police force about hate crime and about intimidation, given that they have 1,000 officers currently suspended for racially aggravated crimes and sexist assault and sexist harassment. So, you know, it's a mad world. It's a topsy-turvy world where an institution like the Metropolitan Police is kind of operating as a thought police as well as an actual street organisation against our movement. But I think it is important to recognise that this campaign, this unprecedented series of attacks on our movement, is not actually, in a sense, a sign of strength on their part. Really, I think it's a sign of weakness. It's a sign, an expression of the fact that they understand that on this issue in particular, they are losing the argument in society. Look at the opinion polls. I know it's easy to feel as if we're, precisely because of the level of the kind of suffocating consensus at the top of society and the level of attacks on us, it's easy to think of ourselves as a beleaguered minority. But the reality of the situation is, if you look at the opinion polls, time after time, they show that the majority of the population support our central demand for a ceasefire. And many, many more people in British society believe that the Israeli state is the problem in the Middle East and not the Palestinians. The number who support the Palestinians is way higher than the number who support Israel in general, and the number of people who actually, if asked in British society, say that what the Israelis are doing at the moment, that the genocide they are carrying out is acceptable, is vanishingly small. We're down to 5%. And it's very, very important when we're discussing these things to recognise that that is the balance of forces around this issue. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the government is doubling down on, not just doubling down on their support for Israel, but doubling down now on a denial of genocide? And I think we need to recognise that the reason for this is not just an Israel lobby that exists, but more fundamentally, it is the fact that support for Israel, diplomatic, political, military support for Israel, is a central plank of the West's plans and the West's operation and strategy to control the Middle East. That's the way round this essentially goes, and that's why they are so relentlessly supporting Israel, standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel in the midst of all this horror. And that's why actually it is a difficult campaign for us. And I understand that people, and we all feel frustrated, we all feel the difficulties and the kind of, you know, the kind of almost exhaustion at times, given the number of protests and demonstrations. But nevertheless, we have to recognise that that's not surprising, given that we are challenging a central plank of the imperial project of the major powers on the planet. So, in a sense, no surprise. The second thing I want to say about the movement, at a time when things are being discussed, is really, I suppose we have to ask ourselves, what would it take to force a situation where our government and other Western powers actually say enough is enough and this has to stop? And I'll tell you what the answer to that is. The answer is a movement with such social weight, with such broad support, with such a mobilising power, that we make continued collusion, continued participation in this genocide simply unworkable. And that's the challenge I think we face. And I think partly when we think about that, we need to recognise that we have made progress. They tried to ban us. They tried to make PDS illegal. But actually, it was us that drove out one of the worst Home Secretaries this country has ever had. The BDS campaign is going from strength to strength. And as Michael says, the reality of the situation is that not just here, but around the world, Israel is a pariah state. And that in itself is something that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't have been for the protests and the demonstrations and the direct action up and down the country and around the world. And that is a major achievement. And I think what we've got to consider now is how do we strengthen the campaign and how do we escalate? And I want to say here that I think the demonstrations are extremely powerful, and we shouldn't get into counterposing direct action and mass protests. In a way, these demonstrations are kind of direct action on a massive scale. Week after week, month after month, in London, but also in Manchester, in Newcastle, in Bristol, in cities up and down the country, we have brought the centre of the cities to a halt for hour after hour after hour. And the reason the police try and marginalise or try and suppress these demos and the government try to ban them is precisely because I believe they are effective. But I think what we have to do now is to start to think about, and this is the discussion for today, or one of the discussions for today in my opinion, how do we close the gap between the hundreds of thousands of people who are demonstrating? Actually, we reckon about 3 million people have been on at least one of the demos. But how do we close the gap between that number and the much, much bigger number of people who actually support us? That we need to have an outward-looking movement. That we need to have a movement that is broadening all the time. And the second and last thing I want to say is that we do have to consider escalation, clearly. But escalation should be combined with broadening and combined with deepening. And we had a victory over the summer that I think is quite important and maybe not quite remarked enough in the movement, which is that at trade union conference after trade union conference, Hossam Zumlut, who is the Palestine ambassador to Britain, spoke not at fringe meetings, but on the floor of those conferences, and he got standing ovations. Indeed, at the TUC, he got a bigger standing ovation than the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. And that tells you where we're at in terms of the Labour movement. There is an attitude amongst working people in this country that this genocide must stop. What we have to do, I believe, as well as broadening the movement as it stands, we have to deepen it in the workplaces and in the trade unions. And as people probably know, on the 28th of November, we have an opportunity to do that. There is a workplace day of action, which now historically has been backed by the TUC. And I want to say to all of you and everyone at the conference today, make sure that on the 28th of November, as well as building the demonstration on the 30th, the next demo, make sure that on the 28th of November, something happens in your workplace. Make it a wear a badge for Palestine Day, make it a wear a kafaya day, or have a rally outside your gates. If you're in a university, have a student occupation or a demonstration. Make sure something happens, because the one thing I believe more than anything our government and the establishment in general who are supporting this genocide would fear, as if this movement stays in the streets, but also goes from the streets into the workplaces, into the labour movement and into the trade unions. Thank you very much.